Welcome. In this final video of geography, I want to look at some other types of maps and then circle back to map projections and talk about a little bit that I forgot to mention in the first video. So here, for example, is a map of world languages. These are major language families. A language family is a group of related languages. People do disagree about this. So, for example, you might see here that for example, Japanese and Korean are listed by themselves. Um, that is one approach. Most linguists today probably wouldn't make that choice, I believe. That really reflects a traditional view that Japanese is what we call a language isolate, which related to Japanese nationalism when linguistics first really started as a discipline around the turn of the 20th century. But regardless, an interesting map showing what the majority languages are in regions around the world. Here's a similar map about religions around the world, and again, you could make arguments about this. This is the majority religion in different countries. So this is at a country level. Before, this was more at a regional level. Here is a climate map showing the major types of climate we see around the world, as well as listed or shown on this map are the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn that I mentioned in the previous video. And then not shown there is a separate climate type, but one that climatologists often believe would consider separate is the highland climate or the mountain climate. This is considered a separate type essentially because elevation is more important here than position towards near the equator or far from the equator, and you might see really significantly different climate types just a few miles away from each other because it's as you go up or down the mountain rather than as you go, many hundreds of miles to the east or to the west or to the north or to the south. Here's a map showing elevation. So this is one of Minnesota. So a map at a larger scale. In other words, a map showing a smaller region. Obviously not as large of a scale as if it were the elevation of, say, a county or something like that. But we can see here that the highest regions in Minnesota are along the north shore of Lake Superior, which is unsurprising considering how those hills are formed. Also in the southwestern part of the state around Pipestone. And then a few other relatively high areas in the northern part of the state, near the northwestern part of the state, rather, in southern Clearwater County. And you can also see the lowest areas of the state. Notice that even the lowest areas of the state are still have a relatively high elevation. There are 600 feet above sea level, and that includes places like the Minnesota River Valley, parts of the Mississippi River Valley, although not near its source area, and then other parts along here would be the St. Croix River Valley. So really along here's the Red River Valley. So the major river valleys of the state, as well as up here by Lake of the Woods and in the Boundary Waters, are areas of lower elevation. Finally, before we circle back to more about maps, the themes of geography, these often find their way in state standards. I can't remember if they're still in the new social studies standards or not for Minnesota, but they have been in the past in state standards. If your school is one that uses geography textbooks, these are things that are going to be brought up in those books because many states use the themes of geography as it's taught. And they are location, place, human environment interaction, movement, and region. These are the 5 themes of geography. So, location refers to a place's absolute or relative location. Place is the features or the conditions of a location. So, that could be in terms of physical geography, its landforms, its biomes, what its physical environment is like. But it could also include in human geography or cultural geography, its human characteristics. What languages are spoken there, what religions are practiced there, what types of housing are found there, what businesses are found there, stuff like that. Human environment interaction. There are multiple ways this can be looked at. In a dependency approach, humans depend on the environment. In an adaptation approach, humans adapt themselves to the environment. In a modification approach, humans modify the environment to meet their needs. And of course, all of these are true depending on the situation. These examples are all human-centered, but human-environment interaction also includes environmental responses to humanity. Movement includes things like migration, the movements of people. It also includes diffusion. Diffusion is the fancy word in geography for spread. So we could talk about the diffusion of new ideas, new technology. We could talk about the diffusion of language, how languages have spread through history. We could just today talk about diffusion of things like slang. We could talk about the diffusion of sort of popular cultural elements. So any ideas or technology, stuff like that, diffuse. And then region. A region is simply an area that has some sort of distinctive characteristics. There are many ways we can distinguish or determine region, and one place could be in many regions. There's a lot of work in cultural geography, for example, on the idea of Midwest. Um, and you might see this occasionally on some social media posts, which have a basis at least in accuracy. Geographers do ask people questions like, "Do you consider your state the Midwest? Yes or no?" And we see from the results that there are places like Minnesota and Iowa where an overwhelming majority say, yes, we see this as the Midwest. But there's also a small minority of people in states like Wyoming or Pennsylvania that answer yes to that question as well. Um, so region is a controversial topic a little bit because you can define a region in so many different ways. And sometimes people don't like how region is defined. Speaking of controversies, I want to go back to map projections. And what I sort of failed to mention in this version of the video, I've recorded this first part 3 times, is that map projections, as we know, all map projections have distortion. And there are critics of some map projections that argue that that distortion is intentional, that say that a map like the Lambert conformal conic map or the Mercator projection, I shouldn't say map projection, or the Mercator projection, are done this way intentionally to de-emphasize Africa. Um, I personally don't think that's true. Um, it's an important conversation to have and for students to be able to recognize that Greenland is not that big, that this projection, for reasons related to preserving shape, and the Lambert is specifically about shape. I said it was in the previous video, I think, about distance and direction. That's true for the Mercator projection, I believe, but it's not true for the Lambert conformal one. Lambert is designed to preserve shape. So Greenland shape looks like Greenland shape. Africa's shape looks like Africa's shape. Australia's shape looks like Australia's shape. Now, as a effect of that, is it true that if someone just looks at this map every day in a classroom, they might subconsciously start to say, wow, Greenland must be really important? Maybe. But I think if we say that's the primary purpose for the map or even the primary outcome, I don't think that's accurate. And I think that does a lot of arguments a disservice. So be aware that maps are highly political. Map projections are highly political, and that people can read things into them, intentionally or not, to try to make arguments. Again, this is always going to occur because no map projection is 100% accurate. And so other projections, in fact, I believe that the Malwide projection, which I'm probably saying wrong, let me see what it says it's intended to do. Is intended to preserve area, but I believe this projection actually does make areas near the equator, like Africa, slightly larger than they would otherwise be. So this particular one does privilege Africa potentially at the expense of other regions, not by a lot, but by a little. Now, critics of that would say, well, that's only fair because in past maps, Africa was unprivileged at the, compared to Greenland. So I'll end with just remind you that map projections are highly political, and you should talk not necessarily about that with your students, but explain to your students that maps are always going to have inaccuracies in them, called distortions, and always compare a map to a globe when you can as you teach. If you have questions, please let me know. Thanks for watching.